good evening, everyone, and my name is Leah Palagashvili, and I'm the Vice President of the GMU Economics Society. On behalf of the Econ Society, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. If you're not familiar with the Econ Society, we're a group of undergraduates who are passionate about spreading the ideas of economics, and we do this through lectures such as these, discussions, and various debate forums and panels. If you're interested in getting more involved with the Econ Society, we'll have a sign-up sheet in the back, so write your name and your email, and we'll be in contact with you. We'd also like to thank the Future of Freedom Foundation for making this event possible, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Ebeling talk to all of you tonight. And let's give a warm welcome to Jacob Hornberger, who will give an introduction for Richard Ebeling. Thank you.
No, let me have my papers. Okay, I'd like to also welcome you. My name's Jacob Hornberger. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I know that y'all are accustomed to having Bart Frazier, our program director, welcome you, and Bart's feeling a little bit under the weather, so he asked me to take his place, and it's nice to be with you. I know there's a lot of familiar faces that have come to our program, some new faces. For those of you, this is your first time, the Future of Freedom Foundation is a tax-exempt educational foundation. We're libertarians. Our mission is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for libertarianism. We've been in existence about 20 years, and it's a big honor, I have to tell you, to be doing this program with the GMU Econ Society, because these are, you know, our kind of people, you know, the hardcore fire in the belly libertarians, and it's really nice to be working in conjunction with this group. As a welcome, since this is the first time really I think I've ever welcomed this group, I'm going to give you an offer that maybe you can't refuse. That you may know that we have a daily email update. We send that out 6 days a week. We strive to make it the best libertarian op-ed editorial commentary page on the internet. But we also have a monthly journal called Freedom Daily. And to show you what a good mood I'm in today, we're going to give every student here, GMU student that's here today, we're going to offer you a 4-month free subscription to our email version. And if you want that, you just send Bart an email, bfrazier@fff.org, and tell him that I gave you this 4-month free subscription, and you'll start receiving it right away. We're really fortunate to have a great speaker today, Richard Ebeling. Richard is one of the foremost scholars in Austrian economics in the world. He teaches economics at Northwood University. Prior to that time, he was teaching economics at Trinity University in Connecticut. And prior to that time, he was the president of the Foundation for Economic Education in New York. And prior to that, for some 15 years, he was the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College, and also the head of the department there. He's written 2 books on Austrian economics. One is Political Economy, Public Policy, and Monetary Economics, Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian Tradition. And then another book called Austrian Economics and the Political Economy of Freedom. And he's just now finishing a brand new book on an intellectual biography of Ludwig von Mises that should be coming out this fall. His articles have appeared in numerous newspapers, Investors Business Daily, Boston Globe, Washington Times, and many others. He's appeared on radio shows, television shows, promoting the ideas of liberty. Many years ago, I suppose about 15 years ago, Richard traveled to Moscow, where he uncovered the secret, and not the secret, the files of Ludwig von Mises that the Nazis had confiscated during World War II and taken back to Moscow. Everybody assumed that they were gone forever. Well, Richard traveled to Moscow when the archives were being opened, and discovered these lost papers of Ludwig von Mises, and it was a tremendous find. The whole experience was written up in a nice article in the Wall Street Journal, and he created all kinds of buzz across the movement. Those papers that Richard discovered, he brought back copies of them, some 10,000 papers, and they've been compiled by Liberty Fund under the supervision of Richard, and they're finally finishing up that compilation. So that was a big achievement for Richard. But actually, you know, all of these achievements that Richard has achieved over the years they really pale in significance compared to what his really grand achievement is. And that's that he was vice president of academic affairs for the Future of Freedom Foundation. For many years, actually from the get-go, when we started FFF in the summer of 1989, Richard was the vice president of academic affairs and published in the first issue of Freedom Daily and continuously every month thereafter until he left to go to FEE. And we actually met many years before that. I was a young attorney in Dallas, and he was coming to Dallas. I was taking a tutorial from the head of the economics department at the University of Dallas, who I'd hired to teach me the foundations of classical economics. So we went through chapter by chapter through Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and David Ricardo's principles and Menger's principles. And one day he said to me, okay, we were getting ready to get to human action, Mises's magnus opus, and he says, I'm going to turn you over to the guy of your generation that knows more about Austrian economics than anybody around. And he says, I've just hired him here in the department. And so that was Richard. And so I kind of claim credit for everything he knows because he started tutoring me in human action. We were going chapter by chapter, and I kind of forced him to learn the subject, you know, because in order to teach a subject, you got to learn it. And so I kind of claim credit for his great achievements in his life. So it's a big honor to have an old friend come and also a guy that has advanced liberty and libertarianism in Austrian economics to the extent that Richard has. The title of his talk tonight is The New Road to Serfdom and the Continuing Relevance of Austrian Economics. Please welcome Richard Ebeling.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here with you this evening. As Bumper was explaining, excuse me, we did meet back in Dallas, Texas, back in 1984. I have a suspicion that's before some of you here in the audience were born. But I keep reminding him that he is a really old man now. But anyway, so I had taken this job at the University of Dallas. The head of the department was a free market, Austrian-oriented fellow named Samuel Bostaff. And he had been tutoring Bumper in some of these early classics in economic literature, as Bumper said, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Menger. And so he was recommended to me that perhaps I would take over and tutor him through human action. And at first I was rather reluctant. Why? Well, I was coming into a new teaching position. I was a lot younger then. I was going to be teaching courses that I hadn't taught before. And trying to be conscientious, I was concerned that if I was going to be tutoring him, it would take away too much time from my preparation of lectures, lesson plans. But I met with him, and he gave me a financial offer to tutor him once a week that I couldn't refuse. Now, at first, I decided to be conscientious. I would review the chapter in Human Action before we met. I'd have all my notes, you know, to give a little summary commentary and an explanation so we could then discuss it. But I soon realized that I didn't have to do a damn thing. Because we'd start off talking about some passage or chapter in Human Action, but within about 10 or 15 minutes, the conversation would constantly digress into him testing me to see how principled I was on libertarianism and where I might leak. So we would then retire to a local restaurant after our hour and a half together for lunch. And invariably, he would pick up the tab. And this went on for, what, like 2 years, 3 years? This was a great deal. Now, tragically, he then goes off to accept a job as program director at the Foundation for Economic Education. I was terribly depressed. Here I had a job that required no work, great pay, and a free lunch. I mean, it took months for me to get over his leaving. But it is true that not too long afterwards, Bumper gave me a call. We had kept in touch. He had me occasionally guest lecture at FEE. that he was going to be setting up his own foundation, dedicated to, as he said, an uncompromising and extremely principled defense of classical liberal/libertarian principles, and apply them to a wide variety of issues. And would I be willing to assist and participate with him as a vice president for academic affairs, which I agreed to. And we started sort of tracing out, well, what issues, as we started putting out Freedom Daily, would we touch upon? Touch upon this issue and that issue. And we were concluding that the more we put out these issues and touched upon this issue and that topic and this issue and that topic, and presenting a very uncompromising and principled classical liberal libertarian perspective, that we would probably increasingly alienate all of the people who had initially subscribed, because our views would seem so extreme. But my philosophy was that I would continue to do this until I had alienated every subscriber, and then finally there would be only him and me, and I would alienate him by being more principled. I guess we almost succeeded in that. But anyway, that's how Bumper and I first met. And I must say that the 13 years in which we collaborated in that was a delightful and rewarding 13 years. And for those of you who are not familiar with FFF's monthly publication, Freedom Daily, or their online variety of articles and updates, I highly recommend that you take a perusal at both the publication and their online daily offerings. It is truly one of the best avenues to have an informed and intelligent and consistently libertarian understanding of the public policy issues of the day. That should be your morning web browsing over your cup of coffee or tea. And so it was a double pleasure, therefore, not only to be invited by the GMU Student Economics Club, but to have Bumper participate and invite me as well. Now, as Bumper said, my talk is on America's sort of new road or return to a road to serfdom, and the idea of the relevance of Austrian economics. Let me sort of start off by putting this in a context, perhaps. In 1990 and 1991, when I was still at Hillsdale College, I was been invited to and was regularly traveling to the former Soviet Union as a consultant on market reform and privatization. Most of the work I was doing with what was emerging as the new democratic government of Lithuania, one of the Baltic republics, even though it was still part of the Soviet Union, though I also was doing some consulting work along the similar lines with the Moscow city government and the Russian parliament. On one of my trips there, I ended up being in Moscow during the hardline communist coup attempt of August 1991. And for 3 days, these hardliners attempted to overthrow what was Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet government. They had kidnapped him at his summer resort on the Black Sea. They had attempted to kidnap and kill Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Federation that was part of the Soviet Union, but he had eluded them, arrived to a building in the center of Moscow, which was their parliament building at that time, and he rallied the people of Moscow to resist this coup attempt. Literally tens of thousands of Muscovites surrounded the parliament building. Maybe if you've seen pictures of Yeltsin standing on this tank rallying the people to defend their emerging democracy against the return to the old-fashioned communist tyranny. And I and my future wife, my wife is Russian from Moscow, were there for most of those 3 days, facing down KGB tank units and actually seeing a handful of people killed by them. But fortunately, the coup failed, and the day after the coup failed, there was a huge celebration and rally in a large square that became known as Freedom Square behind this then Parliament building. It literally was an ocean of Muscovites. And the speakers were, of course, Boris Yeltsin himself, the widow of the famous Soviet dissident and Nobel laureate Andrei Sakharov, a woman named Elena Bonner, and many others. And at one point, everyone looked up, and from atop the Parliament building, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag came down, and the traditional Russian colors of red, white, and blue went up. And suddenly from this crowd of people, in unison came this chant, Svoboda, Svoboda, Svoboda. Freedom, freedom, freedom. That chant was an expression of these tens of thousands of Russians to want to have something that they had been denied for almost 75 years by virtually the worst political tyranny in the 20th century. And that was the communist regime that had come to power in 1917 during Lenin's-led Bolshevik Revolution. The communists, it's been estimated by experts, had killed in the name of making a new Soviet or socialist man an estimated 64 million people in the Soviet Union. And that's not counting war-related battle deaths during World War II, unarmed civilians killed by the regime itself, men, women, and children, starved to death in collectivizations of land, sent off to die, being worked to death in labor camps, or just tortured to death, or more mercifully, just shot. And that's what they wanted to escape from. Now, Russia itself has followed a very, rocky and checkered path since then, and certainly hasn't turned out to follow the path of either political democracy or economic freedom that many of us hope for. But more importantly, looking back on it, for many of us in the West, and including the United States, that was viewed as a watershed. And that watershed that it seemed that after a near century of the 20th century, of 2 world wars, a Great Depression, the rise of all of these totalitarian regimes, first fascism in Mussolini's Italy, then Nazism in Hitler's Germany, the Soviet regime that ruled so brutally, especially under Lenin and particularly under Stalin, and then until virtually its end at the end of 1991, that this was a watershed, a turning point in human history, that we had placed behind us this aggressive appeal and seeming unstoppable success of collectivism and socialism. That the future now offered us a new century that would be more likely to offer liberty, civil freedoms, a more suspicious attitude towards government and its encroaching hand. Now, I'll say is that I had those hopes myself. I thought that this was a dramatic turn of events, an acceptance that Soviet-style central planning had finally demonstrated its unworkability, its impracticability, and that any type of such system would inevitably have as its accompanying element political tyranny with all loss of personal and civil freedoms for the population as a whole. And in spite of a Democrat being in the White House during the 1990s, perhaps because, in my opinion, primarily because of the gridlock that occurred with the Republicans taking over both houses of Congress for most of the Clinton years, it seemed that at least the Founding Fathers' wisdom of divided government and checks and balances, with a renewed sense that this type of overbearing big government had demonstrated its unworkability and undesirability, would result in a new dawn and growth, a reversal of these collectivist trends and something back to freedom. The fact is, however, and unfortunately, and I'll admit not expected to the extent that it has happened by myself and I think many others, is that in fact rather than the 21st century so far seeming to be a new century of rediscovered liberty, the first 10 years of this decade have suggested a return to a road to serfdom about which Friedrich Hayek had warned us well over 60 years ago. Hayek had written this book, The Road to Serfdom, during the Second World War. It appeared in 1944. His warning was that if one wanted to understand how Nazism had came to power and what the nature of its system was like, and how what had happened there could be a threat to other countries, including those who had firmer democratic traditions in the West, such as France or England or the United States, one had to understand the roots of the Nazi experience. And he had explained that, in fact, Nazism was an outgrowth of socialist ideas, socialist policies that had begun in the late 19th and carried through into the early 20th century. That was the ground laying of the social welfare programs, the extension of redistributive arms of government taxing and spending policies, the emergence of regulated industries. And while he doesn't really emphasize it in the book, the fact is that was the era that made our movement towards these policies as well. Because in the United States of the late 19th century, there were very few universities in the United States that offered PhDs in social science degrees. So if one wanted a capstone to one's education with a doctoral degree in, let's say, economics or history or political science or philosophy or sociology, one had to go to Europe for such a final degree. And many were attracted to the Germany of that late 19th and early 20th century. And they soon were studying with German economists and political philosophers and historians and sociologists. And they came back imbued with this rise of the modern interventionist and welfare state. And they were the movers and the shakers of what became first the Progressive era and then the inspiration for what became Roosevelt's New Deal. And Hayek was laying out this. And a crucial element in this is that the purpose of him telling the story he explained was not just to understand how Germany had developed the institutions and the policies that had led to both tyranny and its threat to world peace through aggressive nationalism, but that sometimes we should remember that like causes can bring about like effects. And that if countries that seemingly are very different from its history than Germany introduced many of the same policies and political and philosophical justifications of those policies, over time, those other countries can follow a similar road to serfdom that the Germans had followed some decades earlier than might occur in, let's say, Great Britain or the United States. He argued that the more that the government controls the economic affairs of the citizenry, inevitably comes with it government control of people's lives. Because the more the government either owns or controls the means of production, the more that the government therefore directs what gets produced, where it gets produced, for whom it gets produced, how it gets produced, with what combinations of resources, the more that that occurs, the less latitude and liberty and freedom individuals in the society have. For two reasons. On the one hand, the more the government takes over the control of these things, the more the individuals in the society are dependent upon government employments, either direct or somewhat indirect, for their means of earning a living. And that therefore government becomes the employer, monopoly employer, the only game in town. And at the same time, it means that the choices and decisions and opportunities of the individuals are narrowed. Because now what we have and what we would desire are often two different things. Because what we desire will not direct production, but what the state, the political authorities, the planners decide they think we need and in what distributive pattern. So loss of economic freedom invariably ran the risk of a loss of personal and political freedom. Why the political freedom as well? Because Hayek argued that the nature of a market economy is that decisions are decentralized. People associate collaboratively through market transactions and exchange. The profit motive guides what gets produced and by whom and in what quantities and qualities and for what consumers and what segments of the market. But that means that the market is not only decentralized, but as Hayek explained, pluralistic. There's not one hierarchy of values of what should be produced or what's more important or less important imposed on all, but each of us can have our own hierarchies and scales of values. The imagery, if you will, is like when you go shopping in the local supermarket. You have your cart and you go down the aisles in the supermarket and you pull off that item and this item, and you buy some things and not others, and you decide on the relative amounts and quantities that you decide to have as your preferred combination that you end up taking out to the checkout counter. And everyone else in the supermarket is doing the same thing in their own shopping cart. Everyone, therefore, can have their own scale of value and make their own relative decisions of relative importance and judgment, and follow their own preferences as to what goods will satisfy the ends and purposes they may have in mind, regardless of the choices and decisions others make. And therefore, the market is both decentralized and pluralistic in the choices it allows people, the ends and goals and values that they can pursue, and the offerings on the market. It's for that reason that some free market economists have referred to the market itself as a form of economic democracy, where the votes are through the dollars we spend in terms of the prices we're willing to pay. And while the votes are not equal but proportional, the votes themselves are a reflection of the fact that the income we have is itself based upon how successfully we in our producer roles have satisfied the wants of our fellow citizens. And in a sense, our fellow citizens have given their votes to us. This is the value of the product that he produced for us and the amount of money we were interested in spending for his relative to another. So our relative income shares are themselves a reflection of what our fellow citizens believe our service have been worth in satisfying their wants in the division of labor in our respective producer roles. And the votes we have won with the dollars spent by others in our producer roles are then the determination of how many votes we can then cast when we return to the market as consumers ourselves. So therefore, the outcomes and the patterns are pluralistic and represent the preferences and choices and the outcomes of the multitudes of society. But Hayek's point was that if now the state increasingly sets up a plan, then there has to be a hierarchy to the plan. There has to be a method to the madness of how the government will organize and direct and arrange the use of all the resources in the society. So much here, so much there. Labor here, resources there, capital allocated in different ways, the relative amounts of various goods that would be produced with the resources. And therefore, the plan by definition imposes a single scale of value upon the society as a whole, to which each must conform and to which each is constricted and confined. The reason why Hayek warned that this could be a political threat as well is, at least from the experiences of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, if the plan is to succeed, one of the elements is everyone agreeing with and being enthusiastic about the plan. You can't have slackers, you can't have doubters, you can't have dissenters. Why, that demoralizes the society and throws into question what the government is doing and how it's going and the relative values and productions that it has chosen to do for the good of everyone. And therefore, it is not surprising that dissent is smothered, that differing views are banned, that those who seem to be questioners of the economic plan and the creation of this better society often are threatened with arrest and imprisonment and perhaps even death. That are some of the dangers that Hayek emphasized. Now, luckily, when the Second World War ended, two of these totalitarian monsters had died, Hitler and Mussolini, and with them the regimes that they had led and which had led to so much destruction in Europe and in their own countries. And increasingly, people became suspicious of the Soviet Union, even in an environment at that time of very heated and dogmatic socialist propaganda and leftist sentiments in places like the United States. People became suspicious of the Soviet experience as well, and the appearance of the type of tyranny and oppression that Stalin had and was still imposing on the society. So at least in countries like the United States and Great Britain, for example, the societies stepped back from following completely that road to serfdom. They did not follow the totalitarian path. And indeed, at least in the United States, for a short period following the war, government expenditures fell, taxes were lowered. The private sector was not returned to any degree of laissez-faire or some benchmark of a free market economy, but it certainly was a freer economy than under the New Deal restrictions of the 1930s or the wartime planning. And therefore, innovation, creativity, competitiveness was at least partly set in motion again. And while perhaps the United States was most free in untangling degrees of the wartime regulations, other countries, at least in Western Europe, to one degree or another, did so as well, especially in Germany following the reforms of 1948. The problem is that while they stepped back from the abyss of totalitarianism and released many of the wartime controls that truly were dominating and restrictive and commanding, the fact is that the socialist appeal had not died in the West. It did not die in the decades after the Cold War, and it didn't die even after the Soviet Union had disappeared from the face of the political map at the end of 1991. And I say this not because, as those decades went on, people really continued to want, as they had in the 1930s, let's say, the ideal of following a Soviet model. More and more people became suspicious and doubtful of that. Even the social democratic parties in Western Europe, who in the 1930s and even in the immediate decades after the Second World War still believed in the ideal of socialist central planning and wanted to nationalize industries, but merely had their dispute with the communists in the Soviet Union over the means to that common goal of nationalization through bullets or the ballot box. And to the credit to the principled social democrats in those Western democracies in those immediate post-war decades, they cared more for democracy than they did achieving their goal. And therefore, there were spies who worked for the Soviet Union. But in general, the Social Democrats would not compromise their belief in democracy, that is, political freedom and dissent, and voting to achieve ends rather than through violence, as opposed to following that Soviet model. And by the 1960s and 1970s, even those social democratic parties increasingly removed from their party platform proposals even the ideal of nationalizing industry. They moved to a notion that what we just need to do is to regulate the private sector, to move it into more agreeable and less harsh directions and forms, socially desirable as well as profit-guided production. And at the same time combine that with a very extensive, sometimes, redistributive state to take from those they defined as the rich to give to those that they defined the needy and the poor. Now, from a classical liberal or a libertarian stand, that does not seem like the triumph of liberty. But if one understands that in the 1930s, that the totalitarian ideal had a great appeal, and if one understands that the socialists, when even democratic, had believed in the desirability and the workability of a fully centrally planned economy, the disappearance of belief in the totalitarian system in the Western democracies by an increasing number of intellectuals, and giving up of the central planning ghost by the social democratic parties themselves by the 1960s and 1970s was a major step back from the type of world that many of them would have wanted to create if they could have in the 1930s and 1940s. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberation of what were called the captive nations of Eastern Europe and the arrival of reforms even under still a politically communist regime in places like China, and the turning away from planning in what was then known as the Third World and other countries of Asia and Africa and parts of South America towards at least not free market capitalism, but freer markets, including denationalization and privatization of some industries, it seemed as if this era was coming to an end. The problem is that while people no longer wanted the Soviet ideal of strict central planning, what they had not given up was the socialist critique of capitalism. And what was that socialist critique of capitalism? The socialist critique of capitalism is that the system is based upon greed, not need. That production is guided to what will improve the incomes of the property owners, and that therefore they may choose to produce things that are not socially desirable or not produce other things that are socially desirable. That the employer will, under capitalism, in various and sundry ways take advantage of the workers. And while perhaps Marx might have expressed it in too extreme a term and form, the fact is the employer has an inherent advantage over the workers that he takes into his employ. And that therefore, if not controlled by unions or by government workplace regulations or minimum wage laws, the workers will be unjustly and unfairly taken advantage of. And that the businessman is concerned precisely because profit with only with profit means that he thinks short term rather than long term. He will plunder the earth. He will excessively use resources that cannot be reproduced. He will strip the forests. He'll pollute the air merely because his only goal is profit. So, what we need is not capitalism, not a free market, but a market that is tempered and softened and confined within an arena of government restrictions, controls, regulations, and redistributions that see that this beast does not become uncontrollable and harmful and dangerous to the social good the way it was in the 19th century, before enlightened governments began to see the wisdom of moving towards various forms of democratic political paternalism. That ghost had not left. And now, with the crises that we have faced in the first decade of the 21st century, those presumptions of the instability, the injustice, the short-sightedness, the exploitive capabilities of capitalism, if not regulated and controlled by the government, have returned with a vengeance in the policies that have been proposed and have been implemented, first by the beginning under the Bush administration and now certainly under the Obama administration, as well as the governments in Western and Central Europe, that we are running the risk of a return to the types of central planning and road to serfdom that Hayek warned about. Just in the last year and a half, 2 years now, in the United States, we have seen government come back with a vengeance. First under Bush, and now under Obama. The crisis that broke out was taken to be a demonstration, once again, of the failure of capitalism. That there is inherent in the market economy, if unregulated by the government, the boom-bust cycle that creates instability, waves of unemployment, and increasing social insecurity that only can be handled and prevented if the government benevolently and effectively and aggressively enters into setting the terms under which financial markets work and credit is extended. This was extended then to other industries. Too big to fail. There are industries that are essential to the stability and the employment and the industrial base of the U.S. economy. And if allowed to just go under because of these instabilities that capitalism has caused, we will be faced with massive unemployment, the deindustrialization of the United States, social unrest, growing poverty, and a loss of competition to global rivals who will plunder that which are our domains of domestic and international markets that we will have lost in the process. And the government has to give us that which the market, if left alone, cannot provide us, which includes such things as national health care. The market has failed. It's too costly, not available to everyone, unjustly provided, totally chaotic. and therefore the state must come in and complete the envelopment of society within and under the blanket of a far more comprehensive welfare state. And, as an element of this, there's returned to the ghost of Keynesianism past. Most of us had thought that the crude Keynesianism had been defeated in the late 1960s, certainly 1970s and 1980s, and whether the slayer of that Keynesian ghost originally had been the monetarist in Milton Friedman's quantity theory approach, or the Austrian version that one found in the arguments of people like Mises and Hayek, for instance. It was presumed that both theory and fact, and historical experience, had demonstrated the inconsistencies, the contradictions, and the inherent unworkability and therefore undesirability of discretionary government spending through deficits and monetary manipulation. But that too has returned with a vengeance. As a consequence of this, we are now threatened with a return to the stranglehold of government controls and regulations that Hayek warned us about over 60 years ago. The government attempted to basically take over comprehensive control, and they will still end up extending controls over the financial market. They basically forced partial nationalization on leading financial institutions in the United States in the autumn of 2008. Anyone who followed the news, and if you were here in Washington at the time, there was an article in the Washington Post shortly after the government infusion of money into those financial institutions, where several people off the record reported in a Washington Post story that the heads of these leading U.S. banks were told to come to Washington, D.C., to a meeting at the Treasury building at a certain time of the day, and that they were not told what the meeting is about, or what would be expected to come out of it. And they showed up, and they were given a lecture by Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, and then Secretary of the Treasury, Paulson, on the disastrous threat to the financial structure of the U.S. economy with the economic downturn, and that this would be a cataclysm for the economy as a whole. And as a consequence, the government was going to infuse money into the banks to improve their balance sheets and to give them liquidity. And when several bankers, according to the Washington Post story, claimed that they didn't need the infusions, they felt that they could weather the storm without government assistance, they were told that none of them were going to leave the Treasury building that afternoon until they had respectively signed the documents accepting the money and partial government stock ownership of their institutions. And before 6 o'clock, each of those documents had been signed, and the government had then partly nationalized the financial sector of the United States. And then, of course, followed the auto industry. Tens of billions of dollars into General Motors and Chrysler. And in fact, today, the United States government owns 61% of General Motors and a minority, but a controlling share of Chrysler, sufficient to force them into partnerships with Fiat. And what is the government doing here? It is basically setting the stage to directing the forms, the types, the technologies to be used in American-manufactured automobiles. And if foreign producers choose not to follow these technology methods and supposedly environmentally friendly devices in the manufacture of automobiles, then they'll just set federal regulatory standards that require any other automobile producer, not directly controlled like General Motors by the U.S., to match it, to see that they don't unfairly compete against government motors. They've spent well over $1 trillion on stimulus packages of bringing back the Keynesian methods of doing this. Fallacies that were answered a long time ago by whether it be 19th century economists like Frederick Bastiat or 20th century economists like Mises and Hayek and Henry Hazlitt, that there is no government-created jobs. Any jobs that the government creates with one hand, it takes away from another. If the government taxes $1 and spends it in creating a job. It has taken $1 of spending away from the private sector, and there's $1 of a job that would have been created in another direction that will not come into existence. If the government borrows the dollar, then it spends that dollar on some project or some employment. But that's $1 less in the financial markets for a private borrower to borrow that would have been used for an investment project, a research and development project, an expansion of existing business, a starting of a new business, even just the money to send your kid to college or maybe to buy a house. And if they expand the money supply, you merely siphon off the resources of the society through the dilution of the purchasing power of the monetary unit and the non-neutral ways that this money is injected into the system and influences relative prices and profitabilities to see that resources are where the government wants them rather than we, the people, desire them. And now they have taken over, or in the process of taking over, the medical industry. At the end of the day, not overnight, if this trend continues, for all intents and purposes, regardless of what remains on paper, the healthcare industry will be completely either directly controlled or heavily commanded by the dictates of Washington, D.C. And our individual choices will be gone there as well. Who we want to have as our doctor, the treatments we would desire, the consultations we consider reasonable to incur the expense for, the availability of pharmaceuticals, all of that will be gone. The state will determine treatments, care, operations, pharmaceutical distributions, and finally they will ration at the end of the day who lives and who dies. But there's another element to this that is part of the relevancy of the Austrian critique. It's not only that our civil choices and personal freedoms will be narrowed, that at the end of the day, even our political options will be threatened. Listen to Obama. What is his argument? Extremists don't want to even accept negotiating over these things. Reasonableness is accepting a leftist agenda that we accept the fact, take as our starting premise, that government is going to be involved in this. And then all we're debating about is the form and degree that the government should do so right here and now. But to challenge that government should be doing this, that it should be involved in healthcare or regulation or involvement in the financial markets or managing the auto industry, that's being at the fringe. All we're debating is the form that the nationalization and planning should take, not the principle of it. And therefore, you're an extremist. You're a threat to the system. And once you're viewed as an extremist and a threat to the system in the hands of the wrong people in charge, then the issue would be perhaps those who are attempting to undermine and destabilize the plan and create demoralization need to have some of their freedoms restricted so the plan can continue safely and harmoniously with everyone seeing the good and the value of it. But beyond that, there's the Austrian critique of planning itself as an economic system. If the government has a heavy hand in determining salaries in the financial markets for executives, if the government is influencing or determining the availability of credit and to whom and at what prices and for what purpose, as it may do directly or indirectly through various regulatory means, if it's determining what cars will be produced, with what technologies, to satisfy what uses and purposes, and if it's taking over the medical industry in determining treatments and care and operations and pharmaceuticals and research and development, then on what rational basis do they make these choices? The very essence of the Austrian critique of planning is that without private property and voluntary exchange, upon which competition can occur between suppliers and demanders, we do not have the ability to see the generation and the formation of market prices. And with no market prices, how do we know what anything is worth, either in final goods and services or the factors of production? And if we don't know what goods have value to the consumers, nor, as expressed in prices, people's actual estimates, judgments, and appraisements as to the relative uses of the means of production to produce those different goods, in terms of their opportunity cost, then where's the rationality of the system? Fine, you take over the medical industry. How much research and development? How much should this hospital be expanded? These treatments be invested in? These types of pharmaceuticals produced and distributed? What is the rationality of this? There is none, because you've lost the only economic compass that gives direction and orientation to determine what is it that people need and want in an area like medical care. What value have the resources to make more rooms available in a hospital, to do more fundamental research, to develop and market pharmaceuticals for this types of medical diagnostic equipment, for the training of these kind of doctors, the availability of these kind of nurses? A decision has to be made even to the determination of how many orderlies you're going to have in hospitals to change a bedpan. And someone's going to have to do this. And if it's not the market, through the decentralized process of prices, competition, and choice and decision-making, guided by profitability, both in resources and employments, then the state has to do it. And it's not only dictatorial, it is then irrational. The difficulty is that not only do too many of our fellow citizens not understand the political dangers of this, but unfortunately too many of our fellow citizens don't understand the fundamentals of economics, and certainly not some of the subtleties of Austrian economics, of decentralized knowledge, the need to have a mechanism by which people can communicate and share information with each other about what they want and where they want it and the relative value they place upon it, and the opportunity costs expressed by judgments on the supply side as to what could be produced, at what price. That cannot occur without an effective price system and competitive price mechanism, the way Hayek argued in his classic article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, or his emphasis on the discovery process of competition. And as a result, we may end up going down this road to serfdom that has both political dangers and economic rigidities and irrationalities, a long way before it emerges so clearly as to what is going wrong that our fellow citizens will finally have doubts and hesitancies about where this road to serfdom has been and is continuing to lead us. What then becomes the task of those of us who believe in liberty? Well, Bumper mentioned that I had, for 5 years, been president of the Foundation for Economic Education. And as part of that job in Fee's magazine, The Freeman, I would write a monthly president's column. And I once wrote a piece called What the Friends of Liberty Can Learn from Socialists. What the Friends of Liberty Can Learn from Socialists. I still believe in what I wrote in that article. I said, imagine if you could go back in a time machine to, let's say, the year that Karl Marx died, 1883. And let's suppose that you met a young and very sincere, though perhaps from the perspective of Friends of Liberty, very naive young man who believes in the socialist ideal. He really believes in it. Capitalism is exploitive. It doesn't produce the goods people really need. Waste is created by competition, central planning, social justice. You know, he's a true believer. Perhaps naive, but sincere. Now, if he looked around the world in which he lived at that time, what would he have seen in 1883? Certainly in the England of that time. What he would have seen is that certainly by our standards, and even by 19th century standards, a regime, a political regime and an economic system that, while not pure laissez-faire, did not vary from it too much. Government hardly regulated the private sector. Yes, there were some regulations on child and women's labor and hours, but basically, you really didn't need much licensing to go into business. Employers and workers could relatively freely contract. Wages and prices were competitively set by the market. Certainly in Britain, there was virtual absolute freedom of trade between Great Britain and the rest of the world, and it was at that time managing its then global empire according to free trade principles, so anyone could come and live, work, invest, trade, buy in any part of its empire. That's the world in which this well-meaning and true-believing young socialist would have seen. How will I oppose this? Government is small. People believe in laissez-faire. Private property seems to be an unshakable institution. And even the workers, when you reason and argue with them, are suspicious in their false consciousness created by capitalist propaganda in believing that this is a good system. We can't even easily persuade the workers that socialism is good for them. How will we change this? Well, the socialists did change this. And let me suggest that while they preached collectivism, they practiced individualism. How do they practice individualism? Well, they talked about the masses, the working class, the great historical forces moving society and mankind. The fact is they intuitively understood that if socialism was going to come, there was only one way to do it. And that was you had to change people's ideas. You had to change the climate of opinion. And how do you change ideas in society in the climate of opinion? And again, they intuitively understood that you did so one mind at a time. They reasoned, they argued, they discussed, they published, they debated. And of course, they finally elected people to Parliament. But what guided them in this? In their confidence that if they did this, writing, debating, lecturing, discussing, arguing, one person, one mind at a time, that they would succeed. They succeeded for the following reasons. One, they believed that they were right. They looked at a point on the horizon and said, that is where we should be. That is the point on the horizon that would represent the good society, and that will be the goal, the target towards which each and everything we do will be heading. They had their ideal of the socialist utopia, the ideal and good society. They believed that it was important to defend their ideal relatively consistently. Whether they advocated revolutionary methods, whether they became piecemeal legislation, such as the Fabian Socialists in Great Britain, they all said and believed that what you needed to make was a consistent and principled case. Capitalism is exploitive. It is harmful to the society. It generates poverty. We must present a principled and relatively uncompromising case for our ideal. And third of all, they never became despondent. No matter how elections went, the reversals, or what they viewed as reactionary successes politically, they never lost confidence. They believed in enduring through all of this, no matter how the road may turn, you aim towards that point on the horizon. Okay? Belief in the ideal, a consistent defense of the principle, and not becoming pessimistic or despondent or despairing. And they won. They won. Overnight, no. Over several decades, yes. Until finally, by the early decades of the 20th century, they either had won through violent revolution, as one branch of them wanted to, or swaying the climate of opinion so they could start winning political elections and change policies step by step in the direction that they desired, in the context of the ideals they believed in the vision that they wanted to have for society. That is what we must do. We must believe that freedom is right. We must believe that it is moral, just, and the only economic system that really works to give people both liberty and prosperity. If you don't believe in the ideal, you can never have a chance to reach it. And you must understand why you believe in the ideal. And that involves the principled, consistent presentation of the ideas. What form should a free market take? Why is any form of regulation harmful to consumer choice and hindering of competitive innovation and serving of special interests? Why is it just to not only goods to reflect the competitive prices that are set by suppliers and demanders, but what people earn in serving their fellow man in Adam Smith's notion of division of labor guided by an invisible hand? Is a just system because it's each person's reward for services rendered as evaluated by their fellow citizens in the marketplace of exchange. And that government may have a purpose. But if it does have a purpose, its purpose is to protect liberty, not to violate liberty. It is there to protect our right to our life, our liberty, and our honestly acquired property. To be the umpire to see that there is no violence, no fraud, no deception, no violence against each other. And as long as people follow those rules of the game, the outcome is both just and good and desirable because it reflects people's free choices and the voluntary spirit of a non-coercive society. You have to not be afraid to defend these ideas. It is very easy to sit with family over Thanksgiving dinner or with friends over a beer or a meal at a restaurant or in one's dorm room in the case of students, and you're surrounded by your fellow students or family members and their badge. What about this? What about that? You're just a defender of this. You don't understand that. You don't care about whatever. You must have the courage of your principles to defend them. And that requires homework to learn the principles and the logic of their application. Doesn't mean you win every discussion. One reads Hayek, for example, and he'll often be very self-deprecating when he will talk about the debates that he had against Keynesians or socialists in the 1930s. And he will sometimes say, well, in one of my other famous defeats, meaning he lost a debate because he couldn't quite make the better argument before some crowd. Don't be afraid of that. As the phrase goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So if you lose an argument, learn from it. Why was his argument more persuasive? Why were you unable to respond to it in a way that was either convincing to them or, think yourself, not even the best in your own mind? What are the weaknesses, if any, in your own position? And see if they can be made into better arguments that are consistent and true. And never become despondent. Believe in the ideal of liberty. Dedicate yourself to it. Doesn't mean that we aren't surrounded by other affairs of life. Your work, your family, social life, of course. But unless each of us take a degree of responsibility and interest, the society in which we live, and therefore our freedom, will be threatened. As Mises says in Human Action at one point, each of us carries a part of the world on our shoulders. And we can't escape that responsibility. And if the society is hell-bent towards destruction through collectivist policies and misguided ideologies, we'll be drawn into that vortex and be the victims of it as well. So both out of a sense of justice and right and speaking for what we know to be true, and in our own self-interest, because we're in the society itself. We can't be bemused observers as the world goes down the drain, because we're a part of it as ourselves. But if we do that, and if we have confidence and articulated persuasiveness and belief in the ideal, we will win. And in spite of what seems to be a new road to serfdom, it can be reversed and stopped. Thank you very much.
So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic, and you can ask the question.
The political and economic climate of the 1930s and 40s was very different than it is today. Since the deregulation of capital controls and exchange rates, international flows of capital have increased enormously. Labor is also more mobile, particularly because of lower transportation costs. Do you think that those two things operate as a constraint upon government? And if not, why not?
It's interesting to know that economic historians who have attempted to measure this with obviously inexact data suggest as a percentage of global output, there's less international trade today than actually at the beginning of the 20th century. So we still have to catch up with the degree of globalization of a form that you're sort of referring to catch up with what they had before the First World War. But it is true that the fall in the cost of transportation, capital flows, the fact that for at least a decade and a half, almost 2 decades after the Second World War, many countries, including in Europe, had maintained foreign exchange controls and capital controls, which have tended to diminish. That individuals have ways of escaping. Two famous economists, one of which is Dwight Lee, wrote a book, oh gosh, it must be 10 years ago, called Quicksilver, about the mobility of capital markets with the growth of globalization, and that people can escape from capital taxing and capital regulation by moving at least their liquid capital out of one area into another. And so that hinders or limits what governments can do. But I never try to underestimate the ability of politicians to devise new ways to fill the loopholes that markets have found to try to avoid the existing regulations and controls. As a consequence, let's see what the European Union, and now to extent the United States also, is cooperating with in the diminishing and the ending of tax havens. Right? Countries like France and Germany, Italy, they don't want tax competition. Investing your money or keeping your money outside of the regulations and the accessibility of it to governments, as in Western Europe. So they pressured the Swiss to give up really, for all intents and purposes, their secret numbered accounts and to share information as to who has money there. They're putting pressure on places like the Bahamas and the Caymans to not act as tax havens and try to put penalties on them or trade restrictions that result in them meeting these standards. Even in Europe, Ireland had attempted to have tax competitiveness, and the French have been attempting to restrict that. So the fact is that to the extent that the market tries to do this, as long as that there's this ideological current and political special interest groups that have the power through the means of government to try to stymie, restrict, and fill in the holes that the market finds to get around the existing systems, I'm not optimistic that by itself acts as a safety valve or a counterbalancing force. All of these are important. I mean, even during the heavy controls of mercantilism in the late 18th century, markets got around these things. The classical economists would often wax eloquent about the smuggler. In fact, an English economist named Nassau Senior referred to him as the heroic reformer, who is the instigator of any reforms that may come later, because he gets around the customs shack at the border. And that may be true, but I'm not as optimistic that as long as states have the power and they have these international collaborative associations and agreements, they'll always try to stymie and restrict what the market is trying to get around. That's it? Okay. Gee. There's a hand over here.
You brought up mercantilism. I was wondering how you would categorize our current economy. Socialist, fascist, Ayn Rand was saying we're going that way 40-some years ago. Corporatist, mercantilist, how would you define what we are now and where we're headed?
You know, that's a very interesting question. What do we call the economic system towards which we seem to be moving? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that because it seems to have this strange blending of elements of neo-mercantilism with some forms of socialism, if the government takes over the healthcare industry or never gets out of General Motors, for example, but fascistic through heavy-handed regulations and control. Let's remember that as an economic system, fascism did not nationalize the means of production, or most of them. They just forced industry into mandatory cartels and workers into compulsory unions. And then in sort of like a triangle with the government on top, industry here and labor there, the government set up planning boards and committees and councils that basically told businesses what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce, at what prices to charge, what wages they had to pay, and so on. So it was basically just central planning with the outward veneer of private ownership. But as people like Mises and Hayek pointed out, they basically became merely shop stewards obeying the government rules and regulations and commands rather than market-based entrepreneurs. And therefore, it's a blending of all three. It's a hodgepodge of all three. Now, how historians will look back at the end of the 20th century, if this trend continues, and how they'll try to name this system, other than a hyper-planned and heavily interventionist economy, a particular name for it, I'm not sure, because it's a strange amalgam of all three features of mercantilism, socialism, and fascism. There was another hand up front here.
Yes, I suppose in the same vein of direction of where we're heading, do you believe the end goal of libertarianism is liberty or is prosperity?
Is the end goal of libertarianism freedom or prosperity? As Lord Acton said, liberty is the highest political good, is the right of the individual to control and manage his own life, guided by his own inclinations and beliefs concerning good, bad, right and wrong, desirable. The benefit of the market is that it is the institutional arrangement in which people have that liberty and has the positive and originally unintended consequence, because people really didn't think of it in that sense, that it also generates prosperity. That, as Adam Smith clearly understood, each man knows his interests and opportunities far better than a statesman far away in a state capital who has the hubris and the arrogance to believe that he can manage other people's affairs. And so that the classical liberal or the libertarian believes in the ideal of liberty as an end in itself, and realizes as a complement to that is that when free men are left, as the phrase goes, to use their free minds, it generates prosperity along with it. The lack of freedom invariably involves diminished prosperity, or even a loss of prosperity if the heavy hand of the state is rigid enough. Another one, yeah.
You suggested taking the same approach that the socialists took in trying to convince people that liberty is the correct approach. Do we suffer any dangers of having the same problems that socialism ran into, where they use dictatorships and other aggressive means to implement their ideas?
Yeah, the question, if you didn't hear it, is that if we sort of like try to learn certain things of how the socialists tried to achieve themselves, they often use dictatorial methods. Well, dictatorial methods were an element consistent with their notion of how you implement the society. The classic liberal or libertarian conception of the good society is inconsistent with all forms of dictatorship. Now, one of the things that I have felt has been a problem with our conservative cousins is that they've often believed that the people of the country are not ready to hear the message of freedom, so we have to deceive them into moving into freer directions. I believe that that was part of the appeal for many conservatives, for example, 20 years ago, of supply-side economics. You can't persuade Americans to advocate a cut in government spending, and therefore how much of the economic or national pie the government takes as a slice. So since you can't get people to absolutely decrease the government slice out of the given national pie, we will not attempt to cut government as a percentage of gross domestic product. We'll try to use supply-side policies, lowering marginal tax rates, stimulating work, savings, and investment, so the pie grows bigger than the slice of the government is growing, so that as a percentage, the government slice is getting smaller, which implies the private portion is larger, if you understand what I'm saying. And I don't believe that you can deceive people into liberty And it certainly didn't that way because they lowered marginal tax rates for part of the Reagan years, but government kept growing anyway because you hadn't undermined the ideology and the belief that government should do X, Y, and Z, whether it be with tax money or borrowed money or printed money. Until one grapples with the expenditure side, regardless of how the government is financing the expenditure, which means challenging what government is spending on and for what reason, we will not get out of this. And therefore, our ideal is to tell the truth to our fellow citizens and not attempt to use deception or subterfuge to attain a goal that can never be achieved in that manner.
There have been several detailed, written, and published attempts to refute Keynesian theory. Has there ever been such an attempt with respect to Mises?
There are many economists, many of whom are Keynesians or even some monetarists, who have challenged the arguments, in the case of, let's say, money and business cycle theory, of the type of framework and a set of analytical ideas that Mises and Hayek, for instance, have developed. And even some great friends of liberty who greatly admire Mises and Hayek for other reasons have felt that there were limits or shortcomings in the Austrian monetary and business cycle approach. All I can say is that while such attempts have been made, other than name-calling by people like Paul Krugman, he's done that a number of times in reference to Austrian monetary and business cycle theory, accusing Austrians to believing like mystical, superstitious, false scientific ideas that were long dethroned in the 18th century. But in terms of logical, cohesive argument, within the context of an understanding of the premises and the reasoning of the Austrian exposition, and I say this even though I'm obviously a partisan of the Austrian approach, I don't think that there has been any such systematic attempt to do so. And certainly not that can be in any way said, oh, this raised so many issues that we sort of have to go back to the drawing board. So the answer is, in a nutshell, no. One more question. One more question.
Richard, what do you think about the current state of the ideological debate? I mean, where do you see the dangers lying in the way people are looking at things, and where do you see reason for hope? Do you think Glenn Beck is a good thing?
You know, it's very interesting. I have satellite radio in my car, and among the options are two channels called American Right and American Left. These are the talk show hosts. And sometimes when I don't like the music or you know, I can't stand listening to CNN anymore, because like they have all those on satellite radio, I turn on America Right. And on the one hand, I'm amazed. And I mean that in a good sense, in that people who usually, and I say this with affection, because some of my best friends have been conservatives. I say this with affection and kindness. Most conservative arguments have attempted to avoid economics. Why? Because they feel that they can't win it. People don't want to accept cuts in the welfare state or, you know, deregulation. So they've emphasized patriotic issues, right? Foreign policy, enemies abroad. We need to, you know, be proud to be Americans, blah, 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 blah. The egregiousness, the dangers of these Obama years have amazingly resulted in some of these America Right talk show hosts reading Frederick Bastiat. I turned one on, you know, in the middle of the day. I'm driving back home from Northwood University, where I now live in Midland, Michigan, and this guy is first paraphrasing and then literally quoting from Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson on what is seen and what is unseen, and directing his audience to read Henry Hazlitt and Frederick Bastiat. I'm reading a New York Times article a week ago. You know, one of these reporters, you know, obviously been assigned to, you know, cover one of these Tea Party events, with the usual tone you'd expect from a New York Times article. But yes, and they're advocating this, and they're handing around this pamphlet by this 19th century thinker Bastiat called The Law. Now, and I mean, you open the mainstream news media like the Washington Post, the editorial page, and again, even the Post has their sort of cadre of conservative columnists who normally, particularly during the Bush years, I'll be quite frank, I found it nauseating to read because they were all apologizing because, well, he's our guy in the White House. George Will is quoting verbatim from Hayek's The Road to Serfdom as the dangers of where government is going in the United States. And of course, there's Glenn Beck, who, you know, you can take in short doses. But in a sense, as much as it's sort of pop freedom ideas, hypey to, sort of like a circus sideshow presentation ideas. Hurry, listen, all that type of, sideshow at a circus. It for some people, it's obviously getting the message out to them, and that's all to the good. And I believe that what it has also aroused is something that is still in many Americans, which I never find in Europe, and always is a refreshing element when I return from a trip to Europe, is that while many Americans cannot articulate freedom ideas or even understand them or even know how they relate to how they pull the handle in the ballot box on voting days, there is a gut sentiment still among many in the American population that, damn it, if I've earned it honestly, it's mine. What the hell are you stepping on my lawn without my permission? Anybody should have their chance to compete and make their fortune. So there is still that strong and important residue of the individualist spirit, the American spirit of individualism, innovation, freedom, honest rewards go to he who has honestly earned them, even if his is big and yours is small. And I hope that between the sort of cultural residue that still is in many Americans, the pop sort of libertarianism, and you even hear George will use the word libertarian in a positive way. I don't mean to just pick him out, but it's, I just often read his column online in the Post. Obviously, there's many others. And then the more serious attempts of a revival in free market ideas, the reawakening of an interest in Austrian economics, which is occurring in an underground on the internet and on the blogs. Among libertarians and among Austrians, there's often great controversies about different organizations and the positions that different organizations take. But the fact is that there are a number of websites and blogs that have very explicit and articulate Austrian or Austrian-type messages that obviously a huge swath of people are reading on a regular, if not daily basis. So in that sense, there's an ideological undercurrent of questioning and having doubts and fears about this road towards socialism, collectivism, fascism, whatever the historians end up calling this trend, and a sense that something is being lost and needs to be preserved or returned to. I don't know how it's going to play out, Larry, but that type of thing at least says that it doesn't necessarily have to be a lost cause. So there are grounds for optimism. The late conservative sociologist Robert Nisbet once wrote an article analyzing trends and predictions in the social sciences, and he said that chronology does not mean causality. And what he means by that is merely because B has followed A and C has followed B doesn't mean that it was predetermined, that it has to be that way. It has happened that way, but it doesn't mean it causally had to happen that way. Trends can change. The directions that society seems to be moving can be shifted. And if one has, like I said, the confidence, the belief, and an understanding of these ideas of liberty, and is willing in various ways, with the other constraints and pressures of one's life, to defend them and articulate them and discuss them with one's friends and relatives in any other forum, it need not be the case. Just one other thing is, there have been other times in the last 100 years when freedom seemed to be dying. Anyone who lived in the 1930s and saw the rise of totalitarianism in the Nazi form in Europe, the growth of big government through the stranglehold of New Deal programs in the United States, the hyper-collectivism of all economic activity during the Second World War, would have doubted whether liberty, either political or economic, had any chance to survive to any degree. And that trend changed. And merely because we see the danger of such a trend again doesn't mean that it's inevitable and inescapable. That depends upon us and our willingness to fight for liberty. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the great talk, Richard, and thanks for the great Q&A. Your question I found especially intriguing. Let me throw a variation out to you for your late-night discussions with fellow libertarians. This is the type of question I throw out at Richard in those famous sessions we had where I had to test him. Suppose you have a world in which a free market system produces mass poverty and in which socialism produces great prosperity. Which one do you favor? And I think Friedman gave the greatest answer to this many years ago where he said, I would choose the free system because nothing is more important than to be free, even if that means impoverishment. But fortunately, we live in a universe that God has created that is consistent, in which a free market system does produce great prosperity. I want to thank you very much. We just absolutely love this program. This wraps up our spring semester programs, and I don't know how many of you know this, but the last month's session was kind of exciting because after Sheldon's talk, somebody blogged on his talk, and then that blog was blogged on at the Mises Institute site, and then the Christian Science Monitor picked it up, and so our little talk here at the Economic Liberty Lecture Series was appearing in the pages of the Christian Science Monitor. So it's, again, a great honor to be sponsoring this with the GMU Econ Society. We're already lining up next semester's speakers. Jeff Myron, who got blizzard out, the libertarian scholar at Harvard, we've lined him up for November. We're lining up speakers for September and October. So again, subscribe to our email update. That's where you'll have the schedule. And again, all the GMU students that are here today, you get a free 4-month subscription to Freedom Daily. We're adjourning to Brian's Grill for some refreshments and discussion, debate, arguments, or whatever. Hope you'll join us. Thank you again very much.